I spent 12 months refuting the Stafford Gambit, all in the hopes that I would one day get to sit across the board from Eric Rosen himself, the world's leading authority on the Stafford Gambit, and I would get my shot to refute his own opening and ruin his career. And I eventually did get my shot, and you can actually watch the entire video. It's posted right now on Eric Rosen's channel. I'll leave a link in the description if you do want to go and check it out. But in this video, I'm going to be giving my side of the story. I'm going to kind of talk about what I did for these first 12 months. I'm going to share with you this really cool line that you can play against the Stafford Gambit if you're looking for a completely pointless refutation, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. And then I'm going to analyze the game that I played against Eric so we can see that both of us, let's just warn you now, it was not a perfect game by either side. So you're going to see some pretty bad chess, but it was at least an interesting game, and I hope you do enjoy it. Now, here's what happened. Here is the story. About 12 months ago, I started to prepare for Eric, and I was fully ready to play the following line. After e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, I knew he would go into the Petrov defense. I would take this, and he would play knight to c6. This is the Stafford Gambit, and for the first few months, I was completely ready to go into this really tricky line that I had done a bunch of prep on, and I was going to take on c6. He would take back, and I was fully ready to play pawn to d3, which is the main way of continuing here. And I noticed, studying Eric's games, that I had the potential to go for the following line. After bishop to c5, I was going to play bishop to e2, covering the g4 square so that the knight can't hop there right away. And after h5, so that he can go here now, I was going to play this tricky move h3, allowing black to play queen to d4 and attacking my f-pawn. And I was fully ready to sacrifice material in the following way. I was going to play bishop to e3, allowing black to take my b-pawn, and instead of playing knight to d2, I was going to play this line, bishop to c5. I was going to get a position where perhaps I can get an initiative, but perhaps based on some rules that I, for no reason at all, set for myself, I was looking for a position where white is not actually winning. And I was studying this line for quite a bit, and I was fully ready to go in for it. And I thought, okay, I found some pretty interesting ideas, and I'm like, okay, if black castles queenside, here's what I'm going to do. And if black does this or this or this, and whatever you do, I had some stuff ready. But then at some points, 2 months later, this happened. He played against the world's top Indian-rated grandmaster, and this is Adhiban Bhaskaran, and this is what happened.
It's time to show Eric.
They got this exact position, bishop to e3, takes, and he took the bishop. So this guy, he stole the opening that I was going to play against Eric, and to make it even worse, he did it in the clouds, plus his trash talk was better than me. I knew I had no way to compete with this. I had no shot. I was going to need to come up with something completely different. And then what I did was I completely procrastinated for over 10 months. I literally didn't even look at it, forgot about it, didn't study at all. Then, the day I had to play Eric, I decided, oh my gosh, maybe I should actually prepare something, and I quickly, on the spot, made up a completely pointless refutation of the Stafford Gambits. Now, maybe it would have helped a little bit if I spent just a little bit more time. Maybe I could have easily crushed Eric out of the opening, but as we'll see, we still got a very fascinating game. And here is how our game actually went. I played e4. We got the Stafford Gambit, which is this position right here. But I was trying to think to myself on the day of the match, how can you possibly get an initiative with white? And what I'm basically trying to do is I'm already behind in development with the white pieces. Like, I don't know, can I keep up? Can I play bishop to c4? That doesn't really make sense. That's not a particularly good move. What can I do to keep the initiative? And perhaps the move that gives you the strongest chance, or at least the most forceful move that you can play with white, has got to be this move, pawn to e5, and you're just attacking the knight and you're asking the knight to move, and this is very forcing because black literally has to do something. We made a threat, and then maybe I can take the opportunity to develop pieces, and we'll see what we can possibly get. Now, there are a couple different things here, and I want to point out that if you do check out Eric's games as the black pieces in the Stafford Gambit, you will quickly see that he almost always plays knight to e4. However, if you switch on the computer, you will notice that the real move is potentially to play knight to d5, and the computer says +1 because white is up a pawn. Okay, so fair enough, and I actually was ready for both, and the good news is there's actually a second game I played against Eric. So in our first game, he did play knight to e4, which is potentially the trickiest way for black to try to continue, but in our second game, which I will be posting on this channel, so make sure you are subscribed so that you can see it. Also, welcome to all the new Eric Rosen viewers. Thank you for coming. I appreciate all of the subs you guys have been giving to the channel lately. There will be another game where I play knight to d5 against Eric, so stay tuned for that. But in this first encounter, he played knight to e4, and I had decided that I wasn't going to play d4, which is objectively the strongest move, and I wasn't going to play d3, which is a well-known mistake, and lose immediately to the move bishop to c4. I wasn't going to fall for any of that. I wanted to see what to do on bishop to c4. And as you will see, Eric has never played this move with the black pieces, and this was the thing that I was ready to play. Now, the main drawback of putting your bishop on c4 is that a lot of the times it can be a tactical target. Our bishop is not defended, and white has ways of attacking our bishop and adding a second attacker to the f2 pawn. Now, black actually has a lot of choices in this position, so I had to be quickly ready for quite a lot of things that black might throw at me. For example, the main move is bishop to c5. This is the most played move by human opponents, and it's also Stockfish's top choice. So this is what I had spent most of my time preparing, but also just to kind of show how many ways there are to take advantage of this bishop on c4, black can play, as Eric did in the game, queen to d4, attacking my bishop, threatening my f-pawn, and attacking my e5 pawn, a triple attack. There's also moves like queen to h4, which would achieve a similar thing, attacking my f-pawn and attacking the bishop through some sort of x-ray. And then there's even this move that I had to be ready for, knight takes f2, which fortunately doesn't work tactically, but this is another tricky attempt by black to potentially take advantage of the bishop, because if white just voluntarily takes back right now, black is going to be able to deliver one of these checks and then just simply win the piece back. So there's all of these things you need to be ready for, but I knew that if he was to take on f2 right away, there's actually a counter trick here for white that I was ready for, and that was queen to f3. Threatening a checkmate, but also just threatening to regain the knight. And this is not the end of the story. Even a line like this can get particularly tricky, because if black, for example, decides to defend the knight, you need to be a little bit careful in what you're doing. For example, if you take here, the king can go to e7, keeping connection with your bishop. So in this case, most people, it appears, are just simply going in for this endgame, where black is a pawn down, so that's, pretty good. But I maybe could have played even better than this. You can play moves like d3, temporarily leaving your rook hanging because you just want to bring the bishop into g5. So something like this can lead to a major disaster for black. This would be a really nice checkmate, so this is kind of a cool thing to know. Just know that if they do end up taking your pawn here on f2, you don't want to take back right away. You want to play queen to f3. So there's all of this tricky stuff, and what I was most prepared for was this move, bishop to c5. So I do want to show some of the tricks and traps that could have happened that I was really waiting for. And this is already a very interesting position, because now black is just simply developing a piece, attacking your pawn on f2, also making it a little bit more difficult to play pawn to d4, which would kind of connect your center and help you build a very strong pawn wall in the middle of the board. But if you just castle here, which is actually what most people are doing, you might end up in a very dangerous position after queen to h4, adding a third attacker on your f2 pawn, and also the queen is always eyeballing this bishop on c4. We need to be really careful. Bishop to c4 doesn't come without a lot of risks, and like whatever happens, the next move is probably knight takes f2. So this is something you got to watch out for. And I was ready, and I was fully prepared to play a very tricky move in this position. I wanted to get this position, and I wanted to play queen to f3, ignoring whatever is going on f2 and counterattacking with my own threats against black's f-pawn. And in this position, I would have been threatening a checkmate. And here is one of these positions where the computer will say things are about equal. So in my mind, this is what I'm talking about when I say a completely pointless refutation. I want to play a position that's equal, but maybe black only has one move, and maybe it's not so easy to spot. Now, if your name is Eric Rosen and you're watching this video, hi Eric, maybe you can pause your video and let me know what you would have played, because this is what I really wanted to test. I wanted to see, would Eric be able to come up with the best move in this position? And it's not what you might think, and I thought it would be a particularly difficult move. So, taking into account, this is under attack, this is under attack, this is under attack. Most people, it would seem, play bishop takes f2, but this, turns out, is a very large mistake, because now after king to f1, we maintain our threats of checkmating. We're also attacking this knight, And the knight is the thing that is defending the bishop. So if black just castles, which happens most often, we're just simply going to be winning a piece. Now, even here, there is a very tricky line that I thought maybe Eric would come up with if we got to this position. And the tricky move that you can play is queen to h4, defending everything, also still eyeballing the bishop, and potentially taking advantage of the fact that there's a pin here on the h-file. And in both of these games that have happened on Lee chess, so apparently this has happened twice, two people have gotten here before, both players with the white pieces have taken on f7. But this turns out to be a big mistake, because when the queen moved away, she actually gave black a square on the d8 file, the d8 square, and all of a sudden, it turns out the white king is in much more danger than the black king. It's really hard to deliver an immediate check against the black king, and black has ideas of potentially, at some point, bringing maybe the bishop back. If you can get a rook on the f-file, white is just going to get absolutely destroyed. So you have to be very careful here as white. You definitely don't want the f-file to open up. So what was I going to do? I was going to instead play pawn to d3, removing the defender of the bishop. But here it looks like perhaps white has made a big mistake, because certainly black can go ahead and play this move knight to g3, and this is a fork, and black is going to be able to take our rook, because either we decide to take here and we lose our rook with check, or I have to take here, walking into a discovery. But this is actually exactly what I was planning on doing. And now, if knight takes h1, check, double check, I was going to play king to g1. And here, I'm not yet threatening to actually take the knight because there is some back rank issues. But if black decides to play queen e1 here, I was going to play queen f1. And after takes, for example, I'm perhaps going to eventually win this knight. But check this out. I am now completely winning. I am going to, at some point, approach this knight. At some point, I might be able to develop all of my pieces, get my pieces out, and in these kinds of endgames, the computers always very strongly favor the side with two bishops, so I was excited about potentially getting this really interesting endgame. But that didn't happen at all. Now, black, of course, can play better. Let's come back to this position, and after bishop to c5, queen to f3, black here actually can play a very good move, and that move is, instead of taking on f2, you can play queen to h4. A similar move, defending the knight, giving the king a square in the event that I decide to take on f7, which now I don't want to do because I don't want the f-file to open up. And you're also adding another attacker on the f2 square. So something like this would be black's best chance, and I would have to be careful here. But I had a little bit of more prep, and I was ready to go into a very strange endgame. Now, apparently most players, when they reach this, they go in for a line like this. But this is an even worse version, because now, not only is the f-file open, but the rook is fully prepared to just go to f8 immediately. So something like this looks like you're getting into all sorts of trouble with the white pieces. So you never want to open up the f-file in this kind of position. Instead, I was debating between two moves, and if you put this on a computer for a while, it will say either d4 or g3. These are both kind of the main moves that would happen in some order. Now, I probably would have played d4 because it sacrifices a pawn, so that's kind of cool. But it has a little bit of a point that now after the bishop takes, in the endgame that we get into, eventually my bishop will be coming out a little bit faster. Also, I've placed another piece in black's way, so it's a little bit harder to exploit my bishop on c4. And only now would I have played pawn to g3. And in this position, things are getting very interesting, but black can now try bishop takes f2, but I would have taken this. And we get this funny endgame that occurs after black takes my queen. I would have taken his queen. He takes my rook, and we get this position where I'm 3 points down, but this bishop is kind of trapped out of the game. But here, the computer will say, this is plus 0.2. Okay, barely better for white. I continue by developing my pieces, and even if you get some endgame where, let's say black just goes and immediately wins this pawn, I can develop my knight somewhere, wherever I want to go. At some point, I'll get out of the way, I will win this back, and even if I'm a pawn down, we enter into a very interesting endgame where perhaps I can get some sort of pressure going on the queen side, or perhaps I can get some sort of pressure going against the king side, and the two bishops here actually would be very strong with all of the pawns out of the way on a board like this. So even though I'm a pawn down, the computer here actually gives me an advantage, and I knew we were making a YouTube video, so I'm like, all right, this is kind of a funny, interesting endgame. Maybe we can play this, and I'll decide what to do when we get here. But none of that happened. Here's what really happened in our game. I played e5. He played knight to e4. I played bishop to c4. And he plays queen to d4. This is the move that attacks three of my things all at once. And so I have to figure out how to save everything. And the first move I need to know is queen to e2. And I was ready with this one. But now, the thing that I didn't know during the game is that white here actually has a massive threat. And while queen d4 looks like a totally normal move because it was a triple attack, after queen e2, black has to play two very precise moves in a row in order to survive this position. And I didn't know it at the time, so I definitely didn't punish Eric, who played this tricky move, knight takes f2. So we're going to come back and look at it. But what I did in the game, just to show you what happened, is I decided I could be a pawn up in an endgame. And I went for this line. I took on f7 so that when he took back with his king, I could retake the knight with check. He would trade queens and I would take back. We'd get this endgame where I'm a pawn up. And so I saw this during the game and I was happy with this. However, I actually have a much stronger move in this position. And it all has to do with this idea of playing pawn to c3. I can play pawn to c3. Also, wait, with the bishops on the board, obviously, this is kind of a more important thing. I can play pawn to c3, and I'm trying to get the queen to go away from my bishop. So if she goes, for example, to c5, I play d4, and now wherever you go, I'm going to be able to just take this knight for free. And it's the same if you go all the way back. Now you're no longer attacking, you're no longer connected to my bishop, so I can just take this knight. So c3 here actually would have been a very strong move that wins the game. And what this means is, in this position, black needs to be very careful. And you can try to solve this for black. Would you play the absolute best move, knowing that my idea is to play knight to c3? Well, it turns out the only way for black to continue is to play pawn to b5. And this has a very specific idea in mind. After my bishop goes back to b3, you can play this second very precise move, knight to c5. And only by this very weird looking maneuver, b5, knight to c5, does black save himself from my potential threats of c3. Because here you would have knight to d3, which wouldn't be very good for white. So I don't know. I don't know how many opponents in a real game would come up with this idea of b5, knight to c5. So this is certainly a very tricky position, as long as you remember that pawn to c3 is your threat here. But I didn't know that, so the game continued. I took on f7, he took back, I take, he takes, I take back. And we get this funny position where this is actually good for black, even though I'm a pawn up. So it's already a strange thing that has transpired here. But after bishop to c5, I decide to go up, and the way black can potentially get an advantage is with this move that has been played before, but Eric plays pawn to h5. We're going to have to pick and choose which blunders we deep dive into. There's going to be a lot of mistakes from both sides from here on out. I played rook to f1. He played bishop to g4. This is obviously his point. And our kings race to the center of the board. And he admitted at some point during the game that he had not foreseen that I'd be playing pawn to d4. And in my mind, this was what I was setting up. I'm running to the center. I'm going to play pawn to d4. So that's nice. I got to surprise him with one move. And now I played this very sneaky move, knight to c3. And it maybe just looks like this is just an innocent developing move. Maybe I'm just trying to play pawn to d5. I'm trying to break through in the center. So Eric just puts a rook on the d file in order to prevent this from happening. But here I get to reveal the true point of knight to c3, which was this move, pawn to a3. And the knight covers the e2 square, and all of a sudden, the bishop on g4 is trapped. So I did it. I trapped Eric's bishop. I'm going to be up a piece. And he plays here, bishop to f5. And through a mini tactic here, he's able to at least win one of the pawns, because now after I recapture, he takes on d4. I take back, he takes my rook, and we get this position. I'm an entire knight up, and this should be just a relatively easy win. And I began to think here about what to do. I just have to come up with a nice logical setup, and I'm actually kind of proud of what I played. I just need to find a nice setup. I'm a little bit worried this is coming next, and I'll have to decide where to go. Like if I play bishop to e3 in this position, which would be like the next normal developing move, I don't know. Am I going to have to go this way? Am I going to have to deal with pawn to b5? I decided, you know what? I think my king actually belongs back on e2. So after he took my pawn first, I played bishop to e3. I'm just defending both of these squares. I don't want a rook to ever come into any of these files at any moment. I'm just trying to keep the files, the second rank, under control. I go back and life is good. Everything is fine here. Life is fantastic. He plays pawn to b5 as if he's going to chase my knight, but I don't think that's a real threat just yet. But this is a very normal move in the Stafford when you have this pawn structure. b5 is a very typical way of continuing. I play rook to f1, and I'm just going to try to come in. I want to infiltrate. He plays bishop to f6, and it's around here that I'm like, okay, I'm doing well. I'm a piece up, but I need to come up with a plan. And it was kind of hard for me. This was a blitz game. It was just 5 minutes plus 0 seconds. I see a chance to win a pawn. Okay, I check. I go here. I take this pawn. Okay, fantastic. And now I kind of had the same oversight in this position that Eric had when I played knight to c3. Knight to c3 just looked like an innocent developing move. And in this position, I attacked his rook, and he just calmly moved it away. No big deal, right? He just moved his rook away. But now I play this move, rook to f4, and uh-oh, all of a sudden I realize I'm in alignment with his rook. So after king to d7, I went here, and he took my bishop, and now the material is equal again. I fell for just kind of a basic patzer tactic. But what makes this even worse for me is that in this position, even though I overlooked this is where maybe I should have taken a little bit more time with the white pieces, because I'm actually still winning here. So if I had just not freaked out and I instead tried to see if there was a way to save this position, maybe I would have been able to find it. Because it turns out in this position, I actually have this move, rook to e4, and now you don't have time to take my bishop because I'd be taking your rook. And if you decide to take my rook and I take back with my knight, you don't have time to take my bishop because I can take your bishop and we can get this endgame. And even though right now the pawns are equal, the material is equal, we have the same number of pawns, I can win this endgame by running immediately at your h-pawn. So it turns out that this weakness would have been enough for me to win the game, and however black decides to do it, I can go take this h-pawn, and I can begin pushing my my king side, and I should be able to just win this game. So this was something that could have happened, but it didn't. Instead, embarrassingly for me, after king to d7, I just moved my king. It did that a little fast, but he took my bishop, and we got to this position. So now I got to play this sort of equalish endgame, which maybe is not going to be my biggest strength against Eric. So I decide to play knight to e4, sacrificing a pawn with the idea that if you do take, I can infiltrate with rook to f7, and wherever you go, play pawn to c3, and hopefully begin targeting a lot of your pawns, and maybe if you're really not careful at some point, I can come close to trapping this bishop. So that was my plan. He plays a5. He's going to attempt to rescue his bishop from jail. I take one of the pawns, so I managed to get one of the pawns back. He plays pawn to b4. Now I decide to just go after this h-pawn. Okay, while you're busy doing stuff over there, I'm going to get busy trying to take your last pawn on this side of the board, so maybe I can go make a queen. He takes here, I take here, and we both overlooked another tactic. In this position, black just has an easily winning move. I don't have time yet to take this h-pawn, and obviously it's connected to the fact that black is 2 squares away from queening, so Eric could have played rook takes e4, and this just would have won on the spot. Probably I just have to resign, because if I take the rook, he goes here, and his next move is to make a queen, and so, okay, this would have just won instantly. Instead, in this position, he played pawn to c2, which is what I had calculated, with the idea that now I can take the pawn, he takes my knight, I take his bishop, and we get here. And to be honest, this is not going to be my strength. He's able to go here, he's able to win this pawn. But endgames like this, which are probably a draw, are going to favor Eric in all these cases. I'm the openings guy, he's an endgame guy. I got no chance here. And it turns out that I messed up almost immediately because I put my pawn on a4, and after he checked, I should probably just go back. But instead, I went forward, allowing him to play rook to a3. And objectively, this doesn't spoil the game or anything, but now I'm just going to lose this pawn. And that's exactly what happened. I lost a pawn. Now I'm a pawn down, and I'm just trying to draw. He gives another check. I go up. He gets behind my pawn. I go up here, he starts to push, and I'm beginning to get a little bit worried because this a pawn is just going to start running down the board. And I also have to worry that at some point he might try to go here to prevent my rook from getting behind the pawn, which is something I'm going to need to do at some point. So I push my guy, he pushes his guy. I give a check, and this is maybe not the best way for me to try to draw. But after he attacks my rook, I have here only one drawing move, which you can see the table base is now giving it away. I have to go back, and I have to try to play a position where black is up 2 pawns, and I have to try to draw this. However, I went here, which is another embarrassing mistake. I just wanted to be able to take his rook. But now he has this tactic, pawn to a2, and I can't stop his pawn. And after I take his rook, he just makes a queen. So we get here, but this is not the end of the story. We get another interesting position after I push the pawn, and we're both in time trouble at this point, so he misses his chance to fork my king and rook. He decides to go back, and I play pawn to h7. And now, miraculously, even though it's a queen against a rook, this position is actually a draw. And it's based on the fact that my king is actually in the optimal space right now. It can never get checked. I'm blocking the pawn. The pawn will never move. All I really got to do to draw this endgame now is move my rook up and down the h-file as much as I want. And whatever he does, that's all I should do. I played rook to h6, but I got seduced by the idea of playing for activity here. Now, if I just make some random move, just go up and down on the h-file, black will never be able to make progress. But I decided to go here, attempting to take this pawn. I'm like, oh, if I can take this pawn, I can put my rook back, maybe I can win. But I just simply ran into this move. Now, it is actually curious that I guess Eric actually missed this amazing checkmate in 1, pointed out by the table base here. So embarrassing, humiliating, missed a checkmate in 1, career presumably ruined. But this game maybe is not the leading cause of what might ruin him. He took me. He took my rook. He won the game. He did this. No stalemate. So thank you, Eric, for the game. If you do want to see the next game, please make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can see, will I be able to get my redemption against Eric? You got to subscribe to find out. Bye!
If you're feeling trapped like a queen, no blunders, only sacrifice and see, well, you may have the blues. Never be a chicken when you lose.